The rain came down hard the morning Carter's father, sold her. It wasn't a storm, meant to bless the dry soil or fill the creek beds. It was the kind of rain that buried secrets and washed away what little hope a heart might hold. Evelyn stood under the porch of their sagging cabin, clutching her mother's worn shawl around her shoulders, watching as her father haggled with 3 fur traders out by the fence. They were rough-looking men, faces half hidden behind wet beards and dripping hats, their mules restless and snorting. She didn't understand, not at first. Her father had traded before, horses, rifles, even their milk cow, but never a person. Still, when his voice rose and one of the men spat into the mud, she knew this wasn't just another deal. The world seemed to still around her as her father's hand jerked toward her. "There," he barked. "Strong enough to cook, mend, and clean. You'll get your use of her." The tallest trader laughed, a sound that crawled beneath her skin. "And what's her worth to you, old man?" Her father's mouth twisted. "A wagon and 2 mules." Evelyn's breath caught. Her chest ached as though she'd been struck. "Pa," she whispered, stepping forward. "You can't—" "Quiet," he snapped, not even looking at her. "You want me dead in the dirt?" These men offered fair. The word echoed like thunder. Fair for a daughter's life. Fair for her mother's memory. Fair for the girl who'd cooked his meals, cleaned his wounds, and buried his debts in silence. The deal was made before the rain stopped. The traders hitched the wagon and loaded what little she had: a torn Bible, a tin cup, and a single blanket. One of them grabbed her wrist, his grip like iron. She didn't fight, not yet. The shock ran too deep. They left her father standing in the yard, counting the reins in his hand like they were silver coins. He didn't look back. The trail west was endless and cruel. Mud swallowed her boots, and the men's laughter followed her like ghosts. She wasn't chained, but she might as well have been. Every time she stumbled, one of them would tug her upright with a muttered curse. The smell of wet leather and tobacco filled her lungs until she could barely breathe. At night, they made camp in the shadow of the mountains. She slept near the fire, pretending to be deaf when they spoke about her in low tones. What they'd do when they reached the next settlement. Who'd keep her? Who'd sell her again? The rain turned to sleet, the cold biting through her bones. Evelyn stared into the flames and prayed for death, then hated herself for it. On the 3rd day, the storm broke with fury. Wind screamed through the trees, scattering tents and tearing ropes loose. Horses reared, and one of the traders fell beneath a wagon wheel, cursing as it rolled over his leg. In the chaos, Evelyn saw her chance. She grabbed a half-frozen biscuit, the blanket, and ran. Branches whipped her face, tore her dress. Her lungs burned. She ran until she couldn't hear their shouts anymore, until her knees buckled in the snow. The cold bit at her skin like tiny knives. She crawled beneath a fallen pine, clutching the blanket to her chest, and whispered through chattering teeth, "Keep walking, Evie. Don't stop." But she couldn't move. Her hands had gone numb. The world dimmed around her, just the sound of the wind, the ache in her stomach, and the memory of her father's voice trading her away for a wagon and 2 mules. Her last thought before darkness took her was strange, almost tender. "Maybe now, Ma, I'll find you again." Then, footsteps. A shadow loomed through the storm. Broad shoulders, fur-lined coat, and eyes that burned with something fierce and human. The man knelt, lifted her as if she weighed nothing, and murmured, "Easy now." Evelyn didn't know who he was, only that his voice sounded nothing like the men who'd owned her before. And just before she fainted, she thought she heard him say almost to himself, "No one should be left to die like this." That was the night Evelyn Carter stopped belonging to anyone and began the long, uncertain path toward being found. When Evelyn woke, the world no longer hurt. For a brief, dizzying moment, she thought she was dead, the warmth on her skin too soft, the silence too deep. Then came the steady crackle of fire and the faint smell of pine smoke and tallow. Her lashes fluttered open to a low ceiling of rough-hewn logs. Shadows danced across the walls. A cabin. And a man. He sat in a wooden chair beside the fire, broad-shouldered, head bowed slightly as he cleaned the blade of a hunting knife. The glow from the flames carved his features in sharp relief. High cheekbones, a strong jaw covered in a few days' worth of beard, hair long and tied back with a strip of leather. His hands were large, scarred, steady. When she shifted beneath the quilt, he lifted his head. His eyes were a color she'd never seen before, storm gray, unreadable like the mountains outside. "You're awake," he said simply. His voice was deep and low, carrying the calm weight of someone who'd spent years listening to the wind. Evelyn's lips were cracked. "Where am I?" she rasped. "Boone's cabin," he said. "You were half dead when I found you near the ridge." "Boone," she repeated, the name tasting strange in her mouth. "Calder Boone," he clarified, standing to pour her a tin cup of warm water. "Drink slow." Her fingers trembled as she took it. The heat burned her tongue, but she didn't care. She hadn't felt warmth in days. "How long have I been here?" 3 nights, he said, setting the knife aside. "You had frostbite setting in. I took the worst of it out of your fingers and toes. You'll keep them, but it was close." Evelyn swallowed hard. Gratitude tangled with unease. "Why'd you help me?" He met her gaze without flinching. "You were still breathing." That was all he said. No pity, no curiosity, no demand for payment. She looked down at the quilt. Clean, heavy, stitched from bits of worn flannel and fur. A woman's hand hadn't made it. The stitches were uneven, practical. She wondered if he'd lived here alone long enough to teach himself such things. Outside, wind sighed against the shutters. Inside, the fire popped softly. The silence between them felt thick but not cruel. When she tried to sit up, pain flared in her shoulder. Calder moved to steady her, his hand warm on her back. She flinched instinctively, pulling away. He stopped immediately, stepping back. "No one's going to hurt you here," he said. It wasn't a promise made for comfort, it was spoken like fact, simple and unyielding. Later, when she could hold food down, he gave her a bowl of stew. Rabbit and potatoes. She ate in slow, shaking spoonfuls, watching him work, checking his traps, sharpening tools, mending a torn saddle strap. He moved like a man who'd long ago stopped explaining himself. When she finally found her voice again, she asked, "Do you live here alone?" He nodded. 10 years now. Why? His eyes flicked toward the window where the mountains loomed white and endless. Because the world's quieter when you let it be. That night she lay awake long after he'd banked the fire and settled into the chair again. The cabin creaked in the wind. Her body ached, but her mind was restless. What kind of man saved a stranger from the snow and asked for nothing? In the darkness, she whispered, "Thank you." He didn't answer, but she heard the faintest shift of movement, the sound of him turning his head toward her. Maybe he nodded. Maybe he didn't. The next morning, she found a folded pile of clothes at the end of the bed. Worn trousers, a wool shirt, thick socks. On top lay a note written in a slow, uneven hand. "There's a river behind the cabin. You can wash if you're steady enough to stand. Don't go past the pines. Snow hides cliffs." He'd already gone when she stepped outside. The sky was pale blue, the air crisp and sharp. For the first time in weeks, she breathed without fear. Evelyn stood in that clearing, wrapped in borrowed wool, staring at the mountains that had nearly killed her, and the cabin that had saved her. Somewhere among the pines, an axe split wood. The sound echoed steady and sure. She realized then that the stranger who had pulled her from the storm was not a man of words, but of actions, and that she owed her life to both. And though she didn't know it yet, Calder Boone would be the first man to give her something no one ever had before, a place to belong. The days passed slowly in Calder Boone's cabin, each one carved from quiet labor and the crackle of the fire. Evelyn's body ached in ways she hadn't known were possible. Her muscles, long unused to real work, screamed as she chopped wood, drew water from the icy creek, and learned to milk the stubborn goats. But every ache was tempered by the warmth of shelter and the steady rhythm of life Calder had built in the mountains. He never spoke more than necessary. When she first arrived, Evelyn had tried to fill the silence with frantic chatter, asking about the mountains, the cabin, and the few tools scattered across the rough-hewn walls. Calder had simply listened, his storm-gray eyes studying her without judgment. Then, after a day or two, she realized the cabin had its own voice. The groan of logs as they settled, the hiss of the fire as it licked the iron pot, the whisper of wind through the pines. Calder was part of that voice, moving through the space like a shadow that brought security instead of fear. She learned the rhythm of his work by watching. The way he stacked logs against the cabin wall. Each one fitted perfectly against the next, like he'd been taught by the mountains themselves. How he cleaned and sharpened his hunting knives, the edges glinting in the firelight. Even the way he fed the animals, speaking in soft monosyllabic commands, made the goats and chickens obey. Everything about him was precise, efficient, and utterly human, but there was a gentleness beneath it. Subtle, almost invisible. Evelyn tried to mimic his movements, chopping wood with the same careful swing, moving silently across the cabin floor, lifting buckets of water without splashing. She fell more than she succeeded. Her hands blistered and her confidence wavered. But each evening, Calder would simply hand her a cloth and bandage her wounds, his hand lingering only slightly, and she would feel a warmth she hadn't known since childhood. At night, she lay awake listening to the wind whip across the mountains, counting the shadows cast by the moon through the small windows. Memories of the traitors haunted her. Her father's betrayal, the cold, cruel bargain, the fear in her own heart as she ran for her life. Each image was a blade pressed against her chest, each sound a reminder of how close she had come to death. Calder never asked about it. He never pressed. But when she would awaken from a nightmare, he would be sitting in the chair near the fire, watching over her, the flame reflecting in his eyes, steady and unyielding. It was during these quiet hours that she first noticed the subtle ways he cared for her, how he left fresh water beside her bed even before she asked, how he stacked extra blankets within reach, tucking the edges neatly around her when he thought she slept, how he would hum softly while tending to the cabin chores, a low, rough tune that blended with the whistle of the wind outside. Evelyn had no words to name what she felt, only a sense of safety and a tentative trust, something she had never experienced with a man before. Yet, despite the calm, fear still lingered in the corners of her mind. She was a survivor, yes, but she had been traded, hunted, and abandoned. Trust was a dangerous thing. And yet, with Calder, the fear began to ebb. She learned slowly that the mountains could be harsh, the snow could bite, and the world could be cruel. But there existed a man who would fight it all for her safety. One evening, as the sun sank behind the peaks and the cabin filled with shadows, she dared to speak aloud the thought she hadn't voiced before. Why me?" Calder didn't answer immediately. He simply moved to the fire, turning a spit with quiet strength, and said at last, "Because you were still breathing. That's reason enough." Evelyn stared at him, the weight of his words pressing into her chest. They weren't dramatic. They weren't romantic. They weren't even kind in the way a book might describe. But they were true. And in their truth, she felt the first fragile bloom of something like hope. For the first time since she had been sold for a wagon and 2 mules, Evelyn Carter felt a sense of belonging. Not just to the cabin, not just to the mountains, but to the quiet, unspoken bond with the man who had saved her from the snow. In Calder Boone's cabin, amidst the silence and smoke, she began to understand that life could be measured not by fear or betrayal, but by the steady hands of someone who refused to let you fall. Spring had barely begun to melt the lingering snow when the first signs of trouble appeared. Evelyn noticed it first. Tracks in the muddy ground near the creek, faint impressions that spoke of hooves and wagon wheels. She traced them with her eyes, heart tightening, sensing a rhythm she knew all too well. Someone was searching. Her pulse raced, and the warmth of the cabin, which had become her refuge, suddenly felt fragile. She said nothing at first, watching Calder as he repaired a fence post. His broad back was framed by sunlight slanting through the cabin window, and yet she knew he would see what she could not. He always did. "You've got company," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the wind. Calder didn't flinch. He straightened, eyes narrowing as he followed the trail outside. "They're close," he said simply, almost as if stating the weather. Evelyn's chest tightened. "They're coming for me," she said, her voice trembling despite her attempt at courage. He glanced at her, his storm-gray eyes steady, unreadable. "No one takes what I've chosen to protect," he said. The words wrapped around her like armor. For the first time, she realized she was not merely a survivor anymore. Calder had claimed her, not with ownership, but with a promise, a fierce, silent protection that could not be broken by the world outside. The days that followed were tense and careful. Evelyn moved through the cabin and surrounding woods quietly, learning which paths to avoid, where to hide in case of intruders. Calder taught her to read the land, how the snow revealed the passage of men and animals, how the bend of a branch could indicate someone had passed moments before. Every lesson was a thread in a growing safety net, each one reinforcing the fragile sense of control she had thought lost forever. One evening, while she mended torn clothing by the fire, Calder emerged from the shadows with a rifle slung over his shoulder. The light from the flames danced on his face and he didn't speak, only gestured toward the ridge. Evelyn followed, her heart thundering in her chest. From the ridge, they could see the dust rising on the distant trail, faint silhouettes of men moving deliberately, scanning the hills as though they were hunting game. Evelyn's stomach twisted. They were the traitors, the same men who had once called her property. And now they were returning, seeking what they believed they still had a claim to. "You don't have to fight them," she said, gripping his arm. "We could hide or—" He shook his head, his eyes hardening. "No, this ends here. Not with them. Not ever." Evelyn realized then that the man who had saved her from the snow was no longer merely her protector. He had become the storm itself. When danger came, he would meet it head-on, fierce and unyielding, and she would stand beside him if she had the courage. The night before the hunters reached the cabin, Evelyn lay awake listening to Calder sharpen his knives by the fire. The rhythm of metal against stone was hypnotic, almost comforting, and she allowed herself a moment to breathe. She thought about her father, about the men who had traded her life for a wagon and 2 mules, and she felt a strange mix of anger, sorrow, and determination. She was no longer helpless. She was no longer alone. Morning came, gray and cold, and the distant rumble of hooves reached their ears. Calder looked at her, his gaze steady. "Whatever happens," he said, "we face it together." Evelyn nodded, swallowing the fear that threatened to choke her. The past had found her, yes, but the mountains had given her something stronger than fear, a man who would stand by her, and a place where she could finally fight for herself. The sun rose behind them, casting long shadows across the snow-melted valley. Evelyn took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the coming storm, and realized that her life had changed irrevocably. She was no longer the girl her father had traded. She was Evelyn Carter, and she had Calder Boone beside her, a force equal to any danger the world could muster. And she understood, with a clarity that cut through the cold air. The past had ridden back into her life, but it would not claim her again. The valley was quiet when the first of the traders arrived, but the tension in the air was like a storm waiting to break. Evelyn stood behind Calder, heart hammering, hands clenched at her sides. She had never seen a man so calm in the face of danger, so unshakably certain that he could bend the world to protect what he loved. Calder Boone, mountain man and savior, did not flinch. The men approached in single file, their boots sinking into the muddy ground where snow had melted into a slick, gray mess. Their wagon followed behind, creaking with every uneven wheel turn, the mules straining under the weight of ill-gotten goods. They called out, jeering, demanding to see the girl they had once claimed as their prize. Evelyn felt the bile rise in her throat but stood rooted to the spot. This time she would not be afraid. Not entirely. She had learned from Calder that courage wasn't the absence of fear. It was moving forward despite it. Calder stepped forward, tall and broad, his rifle resting easily in his hands. His eyes met theirs, steel meeting steel. "She's not yours," he said, his voice low and unwavering. "She never was. And if you value your lives, you'll turn back now." The tallest of the traders laughed, a sound like gravel. "You think you can stop us, Boone? You're alone in these mountains. She's just a girl." Calder's lips curved just slightly. "She's more than you'll ever understand. And you'll find out why fast." The air seemed to tighten, every breath sharp as ice. Then chaos erupted. The first of the men aimed their guns, but Calder was faster, taking cover behind a tree and returning fire with the precision of a man who had spent a lifetime reading the world like a map. Bullets tore through the underbrush, splintering trees and sending birds screaming into the sky. Evelyn dropped behind a fallen log, trembling, yet watching with wide, unblinking eyes. She saw Calder move through the melee like a shadow, striking with rifles, fists, and sheer force of will. One of the men fell, clutching his side, and the wagon lurched, throwing its cargo to the ground. Blood and mud mixed in the early sunlight, a stark reminder of the cost of greed and cruelty. When Calder's rifle cracked again, silence fell over the clearing. The remaining traders hesitated, fear replacing their arrogance. Calder's presence was a wall, his determination palpable. "Leave," he said, his voice carrying across the valley. "Or stay and you'll find you've picked the wrong fight." Slowly, reluctantly, the men retreated. They mounted their mules, urging the wagon forward, leaving a trail of broken branches and the echo of their curses behind. Evelyn exhaled sharply, her knees weak, her chest heaving. She had witnessed something primal and terrifying. The man who had saved her from the snow was willing to spill blood to protect her. Calder returned to her side, brushing snow and mud from his coat. He looked down at her, his storm gray eyes steady, almost gentle. "You all right?" he asked. Evelyn swallowed, trying to find her voice. I think so," she said, though the adrenaline still rattled through her bones. "You saved me too," she said after a moment, her voice quiet but firm, "by keeping yourself alive. I know I could never do this alone." Calder's jaw tightened just slightly, a hint of a smile tugging at his lips. "You're stronger than you know," he said. "You'll need that strength. The world outside these mountains is cruel, but out here, we fight together." For the first time since the traders had taken her from her home, Evelyn felt something she hadn't allowed herself in years: hope. She understood that the mountains had not only given her shelter, but had also given her a man who would fight beside her, a partner whose loyalty was absolute. She watched him move through the aftermath, checking the cabin and the perimeter. The forest smelled of gunpowder and pine, a scent that would haunt her dreams for weeks, but also a scent that would remind her that she was no longer a victim. She was a fighter, and with Calder Boone at her side, she would never be helpless again. The valley fell quiet once more, but Evelyn knew this peace was hard-won. Blood had been spilled, and the memory of it would linger, but so would the knowledge that she had been claimed by someone who would never let her fall. For the first time, she understood that survival alone was no longer enough. To live fully, she needed to fight, to protect, and to stand beside the man who had given her back her life. Spring had loosened the grip of winter in the valley, and with it came a strange sense of calm. The snow had melted into the creek, and the wildflowers timidly poked through the thawed earth. For Evelyn, every step outside the cabin felt lighter, freer. She had survived being traded, hunted, and nearly abandoned. But more than that, she had learned the power of belonging, of trust, of a life claimed by someone who cared not for ownership but for protection. Calder Boone had spent the morning working near the creek, stacking firewood and checking traps, while Evelyn tended the small garden he had started near the cabin. It was simple work, grounding, and she relished it, even as the ache from the previous day's labors reminded her she was alive in ways she hadn't been before. When she returned from the garden, she found Calder waiting at the cabin door. In his hands was a small bundle wrapped in oilskin. He set it on the table and looked at her with a rare softness in his storm-gray eyes. "It's yours," he said. Evelyn frowned. "Mine? What is it?" He pushed the bundle toward her. Inside was a neatly folded set of documents, faded parchment with his careful handwriting. Deeds, maps, and marks of ownership. Her eyes widened. "This land," Calder explained. "It's been mine for 10 years. Hidden from the world, worked with my hands. But you've earned it. You've faced storms, fear, and men who would see you as nothing. You deserve a claim of your own. And this," he hesitated, a rare uncertainty in his posture, "this is my name. You can take it if you want. Make it yours along with the land." Evelyn's hands trembled as she took the documents. Her chest ached, a strange mixture of gratitude, fear, and disbelief. A name, a land, a life she could call her own. For the first time, she didn't feel like property, like a shadow wandering through someone else's world. She felt human, alive. I can't," she whispered. "I don't deserve—" Calder's hand covered hers, firm, grounding. "You already have it. You just didn't know it yet. I've given you a choice. That's more than anyone else ever did. You're not bound by what happened before, Evelyn. You're free to be whoever you want." Tears pricked at the corners of her eyes. The mountains, the snow, the cold that had almost killed her, none of it mattered now. The future was wide and open, like the valley stretching out before her. And in that expanse she could see herself standing, not as a girl sold for a wagon and 2 mules, but as a woman with a name, a home, and someone who loved her enough to fight for her life. Slowly, reverently, she signed the deed accepting the land. Then, almost instinctively, she wrote her new name, Evelyn Boone. The letters felt strange, heavy with meaning, yet light with promise. Her father's betrayal, the trader's cruelty, even the snowstorm that nearly killed her, all of it had led to this moment, this rebirth. Calder watched silently, a hint of a smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "You've earned every inch of this place and every moment of peace that comes with it. he said softly. It's yours now fully, and it always will be, as long as you want it. Evelyn looked at him, the man who had saved her from the snow, who had taught her how to survive, who had faced blood and danger to protect her. Her heart swelled with something she couldn't yet name, love, gratitude, awe, all rolled into one fierce, overwhelming emotion. I'll stay, she said finally, her voice steady. Here with you, with this land, with my name. Calder nodded, a rare tenderness in his expression. Good, that's all I ever wanted. The sun dipped behind the peaks, casting long golden shadows across the valley. Evelyn stood at the cabin door, looking out over the land that was now hers, and felt a sense of peace she hadn't known existed. The mountains had given her shelter, Calder had given her protection, and now she had a name to carry through the world. For the first time, Evelyn Boone truly understood what it meant to be free, not just to live, but to belong. Summer crept slowly over the valley, painting the slopes with wildflowers and bathing the creek in sunlight. Evelyn Boone woke each morning to the scent of pine, the warmth of the fire, and the sound of Calder Boone already at work outside. Their lives had settled into a rhythm, quiet yet alive, a rhythm that belonged to them and no one else. The cabin that had once been a refuge from the storm was now just the beginning. Together they set about building something larger, something that would endure, not just for themselves, but for the life they intended to live. Fences went up along the edges of the property, sturdy and high, keeping the valley safe from wandering livestock and the occasional predatory animal. Calder showed her how to drive stakes into the ground with the right angle, how to weave wire and rope so that the fence would hold through snow, wind, and rain. Evelyn's hands grew strong, calloused, and sure. She learned to ride the horses he had trained, guiding them along the creek's edge with a firm voice and gentle hand. She learned to brand the calves with his guidance, her first mark shaky, then confident, until each animal bore her touch with quiet obedience. Every skill she mastered felt like a reclamation of her life, a small victory over the years of fear and helplessness that had once defined her. Calder worked beside her through it all, not as a teacher, but as a partner. Sometimes his hand brushed hers by accident, sometimes on purpose, leaving her heart racing with a warmth that had nothing to do with the summer sun. He never pressed, never demanded words of gratitude or love. He simply shared the work and the silence, letting actions speak where words might falter. Evenings were spent by the fire, tending to chores that required care and attention, mending clothing, repairing harnesses, cooking the simple meals they shared. The cabin was filled with the aroma of stew and smoke, the soft clink of metal, the creak of wood settling in the heat. Evelyn learned to appreciate the quiet, the way each task had its purpose, the way life could be meaningful in its smallest details. One day, a traveling preacher passed through the valley, the sound of hooves announcing him long before the figure appeared on the ridge. He had heard of a mountain cabin with a new owner and a strong-willed woman tending her land. After listening to Evelyn and Calder explain their lives, he offered to marry them beneath the open sky, a ceremony simple but sacred, witnessed by the mountains themselves. Evelyn's dress was nothing more than a flannel shirt and a skirt she had patched countless times. Calder's coat was dusted with sawdust and sweat. There were no rings, no decorations, only two hearts standing before each other in the vast wilderness. When the preacher asked if they took one another as partners, their voices met in a single, unwavering "I do." That night, as the stars stretched across the sky, Evelyn leaned against Calder, feeling the hard-earned security of the life they were building. The valley, once silent and empty, now rang with the sound of work, laughter, and quiet conversation. They had weathered storms and hunted dangers together. They had faced blood, snow, and betrayal. And now, with each plank of wood they laid and each fence they raised, they were building not just a ranch but a home, a future, a life that belonged wholly to them both. Calder's hand brushed hers again, this time intentionally, and Evelyn felt a shiver that had nothing to do with the evening chill. She looked at him, storm-gray eyes soft, and realized that love was not something that could be forced or rushed. It was earned, nurtured and quietly grown, just like the land they now called their own. For the first time, Evelyn Boone could look at the horizon and know that the past could not touch her anymore. She was no longer the girl sold for a wagon and 2 mules. She was a wife, a partner, and a woman who had fought for her place in the world, and had claimed it with Calder Boone by her side. The mountains were no longer a place of fear. They were a sanctuary, a witness to the life she and Calder had forged together. And as the fire flickered, painting their faces with light and shadow, Evelyn understood that they were building something that would last, something stronger than timber or stone, stronger than snow or betrayal, a life worth fighting for, and worth keeping forever. Summer had matured into early autumn, and the valley hummed with life. The creek flowed steadily, the garden flourished, and the cabin that had once sheltered Evelyn from a snowstorm now stood as the heart of their growing ranch. For a time, it seemed the world had left them in peace, but shadows have a way of creeping into even the sunniest places. Evelyn noticed it first, the distant clatter of hooves on the ridge, faint and irregular, almost lost among the rustle of pine needles. Her stomach tightened, the old instinct of fear clawing back. She had survived traitors, storms, and betrayal, but she knew those who hunted the weak never forgot. Someone was coming. Calder saw it too, standing at the edge of the clearing with the sun behind his shoulders, casting a long, dark silhouette. His hands rested lightly on his rifle, eyes scanning the forest as if he could read the intentions of the men hidden beyond the pines. He did not panic. He never did. His calmness was a shield, a steadying force. But even Evelyn could see the tension coiled beneath his exterior. "They're coming," she whispered, her voice barely carrying over the wind. Calder didn't reply immediately. He simply nodded once, almost imperceptibly. "We prepare," he said finally. "No running, no hiding. They won't find her easy this time." Evelyn's pulse raced, but she clenched her fists and nodded. She had learned much from the man who had rescued her, taught her the ways of survival, and shown her strength she didn't know she possessed. She would stand beside him. She would fight. The next days were tense. Calder reinforced the cabin, setting traps and barricades, and taught Evelyn to wield a rifle with accuracy and purpose. He drilled her in the ways of the land, the subtle signs of danger, the hidden paths and vantage points where one could observe without being seen. Evelyn practiced tirelessly, her movements growing precise, her resolve hardening with every step. At night, they scouted the edges of their land together, moving silently through the shadows, listening to the forest and watching for the faintest disturbance in the underbrush. Each night Evelyn's confidence grew, though the fear never completely left. It was a companion now, one she could manage, one that sharpened her senses. Then, one gray dawn, the hunters appeared. Figures on horseback, armed and determined, emerged from the trees. Their presence was menacing, a reminder that the past was not done with her. Evelyn and Calder stood at the ready, their forms silhouetted against the rising sun. "Stay close," Calder said, his voice low, carrying the authority of a man who had faced the wilderness and won. Evelyn nodded, gripping her rifle, feeling the weight of responsibility and courage coursing through her veins. The hunters advanced, scanning the land, but the cabin was a fortress. Traps slowed them, the terrain favored those who knew it, and Calder's sharpshooting kept them at bay. Evelyn moved beside him, steady and precise, her own shots keeping the men cautious. Each successful maneuver, each small victory, built a quiet bond between them, an unspoken acknowledgement of trust and reliance. As the morning wore on, the hunters realized the valley was no longer theirs to claim. Frustration and fear replaced arrogance, and slowly, reluctantly, they withdrew. The forest reclaimed its quiet. The wind whispered through the pines, and the cabin, though scarred, remained a haven. Evelyn exhaled deeply, her body trembling, and looked at Calder. We did it," she said, disbelief and relief mingling in her voice. Calder's eyes softened as he stepped close, placing a hand on her shoulder. "We always do," he said. "Together." The shadows beneath the pines had come, but they had not conquered them. And for the first time, Evelyn felt the valley and the life she was building with Calder truly belonged to her. It was theirs to defend, theirs to nurture, and theirs to call home, no matter what threats lurked beyond the trees. The valley had grown quiet after the retreat of the hunters, but peace is never permanent in a land carved by mountains, wind, and human greed. One late afternoon, as the sun dipped behind the peaks, smoke curled from the tree line not far from the cabin. Evelyn caught the acrid scent on the wind, her heart thudding with a familiar terror. "They're back," she whispered. gripping Calder's arm. Her fingers dug into his coat as adrenaline surged through her veins. Calder's storm-gray eyes narrowed. He didn't speak immediately, only scanning the horizon, reading the subtle movements of the men who had returned. "Get ready," he said finally. "This will be no test. We'll fight for every inch." By nightfall, the attackers had reached the valley. Flames licked the edges of the trees, casting a hellish orange glow against the mountains. The cabin, their home, stood tall but vulnerable amidst the chaos. Evelyn and Calder moved with practiced efficiency, every action honed by weeks of preparation, every command and response instinctive. Evelyn felt fear prick her chest, but she pushed it down. She had survived storms, traitors, and blood-soaked battles. She could survive this too. Together, they worked in tandem, Calder covering her while she aimed and fired, Evelyn alerting him to the smallest movements in the dark, her voice steady despite the crackle of fire and the shouts of their attackers. The attackers were skilled, but the Boone Ranch had grown into more than just a home. It was a fortress. Traps and barricades slowed their progress. Calder moved like a shadow, striking with deadly precision, his rifle cracking in the cold night air. Evelyn followed suit, firing only when necessary but always effectively, her hands steady, her aim true. Smoke filled the air, stinging her eyes, but she refused to retreat. Each moment of fire and gunpowder reinforced what she had learned in the mountains. Survival was a battle of the body, mind, and heart. She protected Calder as fiercely as he protected her, and in those moments fear transformed into something sharper, stronger, a raw determination to fight for their lives, for their home, for each other. At one point, a rider broke past the edge of their defenses, heading straight for Evelyn. Instinct took over. She raised her rifle and fired, the shot striking true. The man collapsed and she exhaled, her chest heaving. Calder appeared beside her instantly, pulling her into the shadows. "You saved me," he said, voice low, filled with both awe and gratitude. Hours passed like an eternity. The attackers' morale faltered as they realized they could not overcome the Boones. Exhausted, battered, and frightened, they finally retreated into the darkness, leaving behind the smoke, the scorched earth, and the echo of their failure. Evelyn sank to the ground, shaking, and Calder knelt beside her. He brushed soot from her cheek, his hand surprisingly gentle amidst the chaos. "You fought well," he said, eyes meeting hers. "We both did. This is ours, and no one will take it from us, not while I breathe." Tears blurred her vision, not from fear but from relief and awe. She had fought and she had survived. The cabin, scarred but standing, was a testament to their resilience. But more than that, the valley had witnessed something deeper, their bond, forged in fire and danger, unbreakable and true. As the night fell, the fire reduced to embers. Evelyn rested against Calder, her hands still trembling but her spirit unbroken. The trial by fire had passed, leaving them stronger, more certain and more united than ever. She realized that the past, with all its cruelty and betrayal, could no longer touch her, not when she had fought and endured beside the man who had given her a name, a home and a life worth defending. In the quiet aftermath, as the stars blinked above the valley, Evelyn knew with absolute certainty that whatever storms lay ahead, they would face them together, and that the Boone Ranch, built from courage and blood, would survive. Winter approached the valley once more, but it was a winter unlike any Evelyn had known. The snow fell softly, blanketing the Boone Ranch in white, and the wind carried a quiet that was no longer menacing but comforting. The mountains, once a symbol of isolation and danger, had become a sanctuary, a home shaped by the hands and hearts of two people who had fought tooth and nail to claim it. Evelyn stood by the cabin window, watching the snow swirl around the fence lines they had built together. She felt the warmth of the fire on her back and the steady rhythm of Calder's presence beside her. For the first time in her life, she did not feel fear. She did not feel uncertainty. She felt complete. The ranch was more than timber and land. It was a life they had carved from the wilderness. Their animals thrived. The crops had survived the first frost, and every corner of the property bore the imprint of their hands. Every fence post, every chopped log, every path through the woods told a story of survival, struggle, and unwavering partnership. Calder entered quietly, carrying a small bundle wrapped in worn cloth. He set it on the table and Evelyn approached, curiosity lighting her face. Inside was a small handcrafted box containing two simple silver bands. His eyes met hers, storm gray softened by a warmth she had learned to trust completely. "It's not fancy," he said, voice low, "but it's ours. For the life we've built, for everything we've survived, and for everything still to come." Evelyn's hands trembled as she lifted the bands, understanding the depth behind the gesture. These rings were more than symbols of love. They were a promise, a covenant that no force in the world could undo. She looked up at Calder, her heart overflowing. Yes, she whispered, her voice steady despite the tears gathering in her eyes. "I'll wear it. I'll wear it always." They exchanged the band simply, privately, without ceremony or witness, letting the mountains themselves serve as the altar. The snow outside fell heavier, softening the world, and Evelyn felt an unshakable sense of belonging. She was no longer the girl her father had sold for a wagon and 2 mules. She was Evelyn Boone, partner to Calder Boone and the keeper of a ranch and a life forged in courage, love, and resilience. Days melted into weeks. Evelyn and Calder worked side by side, preparing the ranch for winter, repairing the cabin, and tending to the animals. Laughter, once a rare sound in Evelyn's life, became common in the warm light of their home. Stories were shared, meals were cooked together, and nights were spent wrapped in blankets near the fire, safe in each other's arms. One evening, as they stood on the ridge overlooking the valley, Evelyn rested her head on Calder's shoulder. The snow shimmered in the moonlight, the creek reflected the pale light, and the mountains loomed like silent guardians. She thought of the girl she had been, the one who had been sold, hunted, and nearly lost to the wilderness, and she understood how far she had come. "You've given me everything," she said softly. "A home, a name, a life I never imagined." Calder's hand brushed hers, strong and comforting. "No," he said. "You gave yourself. I only helped you claim it. That's what love does. It doesn't take, it helps you stand tall." Evelyn smiled, feeling the truth in his words deep in her bones. The ranch was theirs, built not just from timber, fences, and labor, but from blood, determination, and unwavering devotion. Every corner of it bore witness to their trials and triumphs, every stone and beam a testament to the life they had fought to create. As the first snow of the season settled across the valley, Evelyn knew with certainty that this was only the beginning. The past had been harsh, the world unforgiving, but they had survived, endured, and built something unshakable. The Boone Ranch was more than a home, it was a sanctuary, a promise, and a life they would share together. And as they stood side by side, watching the mountains glow under the winter moon, Evelyn whispered almost to herself, "We made it. We really made it." Calder's arm wrapped around her, and together they looked out over the valley they had claimed, knowing that love, courage, and perseverance had built a legacy far greater than either of them could have imagined. The mountains had witnessed their struggle, and now they bore witness to their triumph, a ranch that love had truly built,